Today we join together in what we call the Missoula Valley to acknowledge and honor the land on which we stand. Previously known by its original Salish inhabitants as the place of the small bull trout. Along our beautiful Clark Fork and Bindwick rivers that were traditionally called the freezing waters or the waters of the Red Osier dogwood. We would like to honor the ancestral stewards of this land, the Bitterroot Salish, the Pend Oreille, the Northern Shoshone, the Nez Perce, and all their descendants. We are now recognizing that these people took incredible care of these lands over the millennia. The past 200 years brought experiences that were not always beneficial for our flora and fauna. These are lessons we can carry forward to build a better future for our children and our children's children. Lessons of respect for our land, our animals, and all people.
That's ridiculous.
So, I'd like to always use this to put things in a little bit of perspective from the indigenous scale of time. If we were to compress the last 10,000 years of indigenous existence in this area to a single 24-hour day, Lewis and Clark would show up a little after 11:30 p.m. So let's do the math. Indigenous people were here 23 and a half hours before all the rest of us showed up. That to me is pretty incredible. Think about that one. So, on with the show.
Yeah.
You folks are in for a victory today. We've got a guest who comes from Virginia and is going to grace us with her presence. The story of Thomas Jefferson's Corps of Discovery is ingrained in the history of our nation and essential in our understanding of the past. The story of Lucy Meriwether Lewis Marks, the mother of Meriwether Lewis, is largely unknown. Lucy Meriwether was born into wealth on a plantation in Virginia in 1752 and grew up to raise her own family during and after the uncertain era of the American Revolution. A woman both of her times and ahead of her times, Lucy was determined to fulfill the role expected of upper-class women at the turn of the 19th century, while remaining independent and dedicated to her own pursuits. She managed a large plantation household, including dozens of enslaved people, and followed her passion for healing and the natural world, all the while remaining fiercely devoted to her son, Meriwether. So if you can just step back in time and engage your imaginations. Then go back to July 4th, 1826. This is after Meriwether Lewis is gone. The 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. As with all historic perspectives, there are ideas and language that serve those times that are different from what we see acceptable today. What would Lucy Marks share with us about her life and the remarkable relationship she had with her son Meriwether Lewis? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lucy Meriwether Lewis Marks.
1826. Where does the time go? Sometimes I wonder if I'll have enough time to get everything done that I want to in this life. Do you ever feel that way? That you might run out of time before you get everything done? Here it is, the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the founding of our country. Sometimes I wonder if we'll see another 50 years. But we've been through so much so far. I imagine we are destined to see a few more years.
I got this.
Something else
I think
tomorrow. the death of my neighbor,
Getting it.
Thomas Jefferson, who had no small part in the events of 50 years ago. He lived a long life, most of it in wealth and power. There's to be a funeral for him tomorrow, just a small gathering of family. There's no time to gather a crowd of mourners. And that's just as well. There are no servants there to receive them.
I just need some troubleshooting time, but the
And
internals are
Monticello
picked up.
itself has fallen into disrepair. Now, I suppose I would tell a story. But I could start right there.
Put that up there somewhere. Yeah. Just go ahead. Yeah.
The beginning is my father, Thomas Meriwether, a proud,
It's the testing to see
He
if
had 9,000
it's picking up before I
and the
drop it
slaves
off.
to clear and plant.
The internals being picked up.
But he was also a respected healer. And when I was just a little girl, he was taken by the hand.
Yeah.
And we walked through the woodland
I just
paths
need
over
to
there in the garden, and he'd say, "Now, Lucy, most people would trample these plants out of hand. But if you know their secrets, some of them have properties that could ease suffering." Well, I didn't have them in my life very long. I remember those walks, and I remember
I
his
also just
ideas
changed
about
the
the plants.
AF
And eventually I'll become a
Just stick it
healer
up
in
there
my own
somewhere.
right.
Okay.
And he died when I was young. My mother remarried Robert Boots. See, but his name was combined with ours. It was a vast home. Now, you might think my sisters and I were raised to be pampered Southern women, like many suppose. That's not the case. My stepfather had other ideas. The purpose of a woman is to serve. She is to serve her family and her legacy, and so how much better could she serve if she has a bit of knowledge, if she has some education? It wasn't very popular when I was growing up to educate women, but my stepfather made sure we had tutors. We learned, of course, music and stitching and what have you, but we also learned our science. We learned about practical management. And as young as I was at the time, I knew that I was being prepared to fulfill the role that was expected when I would one day be a plantation mistress on my own. We would be able to make our own fabric if it came to it. When I was 17 years old, I married William Lewis, and I went to live at his plantation, Locust Hill, Albemarle County, Virginia. He was involved with a lot of the militia activities and things leading up to the war, and he was gone most of the time. So in addition to being well prepared, all of them putting a stake in the ground that this had to end, all of them to a man considered traitors from that moment on. By the time my son Reuben was born in 1777, the war had begun in earnest. And there I was, you see, there I was. I had small children to raise, on the one hand, and on the other hand, wondering if the British would come over the hill at any moment, put us out of our house, burn it to the ground, leave us destitute. And at night when I put the children to bed, I told them stories. Bible stories, you know, about David and Goliath, and Deborah, Gideon, leading God's chosen people to victory against all odds. We must be strong, I told them. We must be ready to serve our country if they need us. I watched them fall asleep, see, and I told them everything was going to be all right, and in my heart I didn't know that. What if there were to be a raid and I should be killed? What would become of them? So much is asked of women at times like these. To raise small, strong sons and daughters, to protect the family's legacy at all costs. Posterity, they tell us, will reap the benefits of the sacrifice that we are making now. But I can't help but wonder if anyone in the future will give a second thought to the sacrifices we are making now. Well then, Mr. Lewis died after 11 years of marriage. On his deathbed, he counseled me that I should remarry as quickly as possible. He recommended John Marks, a man of his acquaintance who he thought would be suitable. And, well, I had 3 small children to raise. I knew my duty. So after 6 months from his death, I married John Marks. He was a kind man, showed affection to my children. It is easy to be obedient and agreeable to a man such as that. His plantation was on the frontier in Georgia, on the Broad River. And he told me that after the war was over, we would move there. Well, now I didn't want to leave Virginia. I didn't want to leave my home, but, well, it came to pass that we moved to Georgia. I had an opportunity to be agreeably obedient to my new husband. And actually, the Marks family did quite well in Georgia. The land was fertile for growing crops. The Marks family owned hundreds of acres. I bore 2 more children, and I came into my own. I stepped into my practice as a healer, an herb doctor. They called us granny women in those days. Maybe they still do. I qualify now. But traveling to the bedside of anyone, black or white, occasions from birth to death, from joy to sorrow, as God sees fit. The gift of healing is something I do not take for granted, and it has brought me great fulfillment in this life. And it is also there in Georgia that I saw my son Meriwether come into his own, take a real interest in nature and plants. Now, Meriwether was determined not to profit from any of the education that I offered him in terms of reading and writing. He loved to be outside. He couldn't wait to be outside. In fact, sometimes I would come down in the morning to the kitchen, and here's my young son. He's causing some sort of a commotion. He has brought in a pheasant or a rabbit that he took down while spending the night in the woods by himself. Oh, he couldn't get enough of being outdoors. And I took him by the hand, you see. I took him by the hand like my father before me. We walked the woodland paths. I showed him about plants as much as I could impart to him. There was a variety of chokecherry there in Georgia, similar to the kind that was in Virginia. And I said, now, Meriwether, if you strip the bark off of this and boil it, you will have a decoction that can ease stomach distress. That humble shrub, if you know its secrets, it has the power to relieve suffering. Traditional medicine, the traditional native knowledge of plants, you see. People who live in the landscape know about these. The Africans that are among us now, the Negroes, their country that they came from, they have great knowledge of their plants. And of course the Indians, who better to know what is in the landscape for healing than the people who live here for generations. I've learned from them all. And any healer knows, no matter what tradition they are practicing, that it is the power of the plant, the power of the body, and the grace of God that causes a person to get well. Well, as I said, I gave Meriwether as much plant knowledge as he could soak up, and he seemed quite interested. And I wondered if he wouldn't be the one to continue the tradition of healing in our family. But you see, Meriwether was the son of a planter. It was his destiny to learn to manage a plantation, and so he was sent from Georgia back to Locust Hill in Virginia to take up his education for that end. And honestly, he wrote me letters. He had matured somewhat and was more agreeable to having learning bestowed upon him. But I missed him so much. I missed him. And when Mr. Marks died a few years later, I felt no obligation to stay in Georgia. I wanted to go home, back to Locust Hill, back to my family there. So Meriwether fetched me home. Now, he had come of age. Locust Hill was his outright at that time. like I had always suspected, it wasn't going to be enough for him. He saw that I was completely capable of running the plantation by myself. And so as soon as he was comfortable with that, he joined me off. And off he went. Now, it seems that the farmers in western Pennsylvania were very unhappy about Congress taxing their whiskey production. And they were not going to pay the taxes. Well, Congress went into a great deal of debt in order to finance their revolution. How were they going to pay it back if they didn't have taxes? But the farmers in western Pennsylvania insisted the government knew nothing of their hardships, and they refused to pay. So Congress would raise an army. General Washington himself would lead. Off they would go. They would put down the rebellion. They would arrest the leaders and hang them for traitors, which I thought was interesting language coming from men who had recently been called traitors themselves. Our new country was more fragile than people supposed. Men wave their arms and shout and complain about taxation without representation. And then when they fight a war and get representation, they don't want to pay the taxes then either. There was so much at stake for the new country. Well, I talk of these things because Meriwether wrote to me. When he was home, we discussed these things. Now, he told me, Mother, if a political discussion were to come up, don't you give your opinions in public. It's not seemly for a woman to do that. But I learned so much from my conversations with him. And well, when he was gone, I missed him. So there he was in the army. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion, as it came to be called, was about put down by the time Meriwether got there. But the life of a soldier suited him. But first of all, it was outdoors. So anything that would be outdoors and moving in an adventure around every corner, I mean, that is what he wanted to do. And so for 5 years, he was gone. He wrote to me of the conditions of the army. He wrote to me about all of the things he was learning. And when he finally came home, it must have been about 1800, he had achieved the rank of captain. My bright, curious boy had grown into an adventurous young man. Now, we did not always see eye to eye, mind you. I guess all mothers struggle to understand their children sometimes. Meriwether was a singular man now, and I couldn't help but wonder what his destiny might be. And of course, I wasn't surprised when Mr. Jefferson was elected president and selected Meriwether to go with him to Washington as his secretary. Off they went. Oh, the letters he wrote to me. Mother, there's a whitewashed mansion standing in the middle of a field of weeds surrounded by construction material. And the two of them rattling around in that big mansion like two mice in a church, he said. But even that did not last long. You see, Mr. Jefferson had a grand vision. He wanted to explore the Louisiana Territory, that vast tract of land west of the Mississippi. He believed that there surely was a water route all the way through the land to the Western Sea, and he appointed Meriwether to lead an expedition to go and see if such a route existed. Well, he was so thrilled to be chosen, and equally pleased when his good friend, a man he had met in the army, William Clark, agreed to go with him. There was so much to do. Oh, there was so much to do, so much to learn. He wrote to me of their progress, and I was not deceived, mind you, by his insistence that this expedition was by no means dangerous. We will be traveling through Indian tribes that are altogether friendly to the United States, and I consider my chances for life just as great as if I were to stay home for the same length of time. This expedition is as honorable to me as it is important to my country. Well, now what do you think? Of course I was concerned. He was going into land no one knew anything about, but I know what Meriwether was made of. I knew whatever challenge came to him, he would be able to meet it. He also counseled me not to be worried. He said, Mother, I have the pre-conviction that I shall return safely, and I do not want you to suffer any anxiety for my safe return. So off they went. I believe they gathered there near St. Louis in the fall of 1803, so they were ready to go up the river the very next spring as soon as the ice was gone. And the following winter they spent with the Mandan Indians at that village. And then the last letter I had from him was the spring of 1805. He wrote, I am stepping into land that until now has been a complete mystery, and I will do my best to chronicle everything that I encounter. Of course, I didn't get that letter until months later. By the time I read it, he was well on his way into this mysterious land. And every time I read that letter or any other of his letters, I was imagining, what were they doing now? What adventure, what discovery was he making? And so the months passed. Christmas of that year, Mr. Jefferson had a grand celebration there at Monticello. Oh, the mansion was lit from one end to the other with, I bet they used a month's worth of candles just for that one night. And no expense spared for the food or the favors. And amidst all that company, and with all that opulence and plenty surrounding us, we wondered, where were the men? Were they yet alive? Would Providence keep them and bring them home safely to us? Well, 1806 began, and I knew we weren't supposed to hear, but of course, every month that passed weighed more and more heavily on me. That summer came, weather was terrible. We had no idea what sort of crops or harvest we would get, in addition to which a fever spread through the area. And I was on call constantly. My healing services were needed. Quite frankly, by the time butchering season came along, in the fall I was tired. But I do remember the day. I do remember the day when I was in the car, collecting the last of the lavender. And I heard the horses on the road at a dead run coming up the road, and the shouting Mrs. Marks, they are returned. To a man, everyone that left Fort Mandan has returned, and they are coming home. Oh, but even then it was another month before they were before us. Every town they passed through, from St. Louis to Virginia, no matter how small, everyone wanted to have a celebration, a feast for these brave men of the expedition. And when he finally rode into the yard, stepped off his horse, and stood before me, after so long an absence, seemed nothing short of a miracle. He put his arm around me and said, I am come home, Mother, and I told you that I would. Everyone who knew that he was back, friends and family, why, they all wanted to come and hear his stories. And they came every day, and oh my goodness, he told them his stories. The one that I remember he never tired of telling was the first time he saw the great falls of the Missouri. And every time he told it, it seemed like he was struggling to find better words to describe something that we who were listening had not even a bit of imagination to understand, such a natural wonder. One afternoon, it was very quiet. There weren't any visitors for the moment, and he got his journals out. And he showed me some of the pages, the plants that he had drawn, the illustrations. Now, some I understood, goldenrod and aster, they seem to be everywhere, but some are complete strangers to me. A prickly pear cactus, a small fleshy pear, beautiful when a hillside of these is in bloom, but treacherous to walk through. And another small little plant grows close to the ground with a taproot, he said, a bitterroot flower. And that root, he said, can be scraped and boiled, and then the solution can be had as food or for healing. He said it lives up to his name. He found it completely disagreeable. But he said that the Indian people are anxious for it to bloom in the spring so that they can have so much to know and learn and share. I thought he should stay home. He'd been gone for a long time. I thought he would be better off there. That was his place, Locust Hill. He should take a wife. He should settle down. Our family should all be together. But I don't think he was home. 10 days, maybe 2 weeks at the most, before he headed for Washington, where he had to deliver the unfortunate news in person to Mr. Jefferson that there was no direct water route across that vast territory. But there was so much else, he said. So much for the future of this nation. Well, then, Mr. Jefferson appointed Meriwether to be the governor of Louisiana Territory, that tract of land that he had just returned from. In the years that he was gone, people had begun to move across the river into that territory and to settle, and it needed governance. And the people who had been in charge up to this point were not doing a very good job. There was corruption and unrest there. Of course, being Meriwether, he wanted to put all that right, and he tried doing that from afar. It was not something he could successfully do, and in addition to that, he was expected to prepare those journals to be published. And he made some start to do that, but it was too much for him. It was too much for him. He was not a person disposed to all of that pressure. And Mr. Jefferson should have known better, and Meriwether, his devotion to that man made it impossible for him to refuse anything that was asked by him. He became ill. He came back to Locust Hill for several months. We did our best to get him on his feet, and he was fit and fine when he left Locust Hill. I don't remember. Maybe 08. But I didn't see him very much. After that, I didn't write very often. The beginning of 1809, now I knew that he was in St. Louis. My son Reuben had gone to St. Louis and was engaging in some of the fur trade enterprises there, and he kept in touch. But what came next, I mostly found out about after the fact. That in the fall of 1809, Meriwether and Miss Captain Clark had decided that they would go east to Washington to try to sort out some of the difficulties that had been taking place in the Western Territory, some of the debts that were not being honored. And then in November, out of the blue, word came that Captain Meriwether Clark, famous and respected leader of the expedition to the Western Sea, was dead. Shot at a wayside inn on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. Apparently with no one to give assistance, he took his own life. As the years pass, do we come to regret our decisions? A few weeks after receiving that unbelievable news, Mr. Pernier Mr. Bernier, however you want to say it, he was traveling with Meriwether. He came to Locust Hill. And I refused to see him. I should have. How did I know nothing substantial would be done to look into my son's death? I should have seen him. I should have talked to him. He was the last to see my son alive. And a few weeks later, Captain Clark, on his way to Washington, he stopped. And I made myself absent. I didn't want to see him either. Didn't want to see him. How quick they all were to accept death by his own hand, relying on accounts, vague accounts, some of them, some from people who weren't even there then, accounts that have changed over the years. My son was not an easy person. He could be difficult. He was prideful and passionate. He was demanding of himself and others, and worried so that he would be judged by other people's standards. Well, I know these things now, but that he struggled, that he was in despair, I can't help but wonder if I failed him in some way. And so my son is buried by the side of the Manchester. Who washed his shattered body to prepare it for the grave, and wrapped it in a clean shroud, if there was even one available? Did they even build him a proper pine box? Who stood by the grave and offered some farewell gesture, some final words of comfort? Who was there that day when my son was laid to rest? Well, now, I received a copy of the journals after they were published. And I held those books in my hand and read his words, read the turn of phrase, the descriptions of raging storms and monstrous bears and Indians with peculiar habits. My son lived again. Oh, I heard his voice, and I understood. I understood by the way he was describing his journey all right then, I remember one story in particular. Meriwether and some of the men were separated from the main body of the corps, and they were stricken with a stomach distress. And so Meriwether found choke cherry, and he stripped the bark, and he boiled it, and it produced a dark, astringent decoction which he drank at intervals over the day, and by evening his symptoms were completely relieved, and he had a pleasant night's rest. I read the journals from time to time now. They are a testament to Meriwether's service to his country. I think he will be proud. I seem destined to outlive all the people that I love. I have lost 2 husbands and 3 children, and well, I know I'll see them again. My faith is strong. Jane, my daughter, her family, and recently Reuben was married and come back here to Locust Hill. They're all here. They can handle the everyday management of the plantation. I am more at liberty to travel to answer the call of those in need of healing. Although my daughter cautions me. She says, "Mother, you aren't as young as you used to be. You have no business riding around on horseback across these hills. What if the horse should shy, hit you into the scrub, and we shouldn't find you until it was too late?" Well, that may happen someday. It's not going to happen today. Because today is the 4th of July. We will celebrate our country's very hard-won 50th birthday. And I imagine there'll be a moment of silence for Mr. Jefferson. He fell into so much debt as the years went by. Can't imagine that he wasn't more aware. But he continued to live lavishly, poured money into that University of Virginia, and finally the debts got so great that they could not be ignored. Congress held an auction. And among other things, bought his books, 8,000 of them, to start a national library. His biggest asset, 152 slaves, who he promised would not be parted from him, and he would see their freedom in his lifetime, and they were sold. But that wasn't enough to cover the debts, and eventually the bank foreclosed. He lost it. Now, don't get me wrong. I take no satisfaction that Mr. Jefferson has come to such an end, some might say, by his own hand. Well, none of us knows how we'll be remembered. If they remember us at all. This posterity they all talk about. Who knows? Who knows what they will choose to remember, but my son will be remembered. And he'll be remembered well. Right now there are mothers raising sons who will hear the story of Meriwether Lewis, and they will be inspired to do great things for their country. And their mothers will be proud. Well, Mr. Mihalis, imagine talk about as much as they want to hear. Could we,
Knowing this is still 1826, would anybody have any questions to ask our guest? In the back?
These are questions about John Marks. John Marks had applied for a job near Ivy, Virginia, and he was turned down because Thomas Jefferson not there with him, and wrote a letter asking him to receive the job. Can you talk to that?
the question that I heard is about Mr. Marks applying for a job, and perhaps Mr. Jefferson standing in the way of his success. And Mr. Jefferson stood in the way of whatever he wanted to stand in the way of. And I am unfamiliar with that situation that you described. Mr. Marks did not discuss.
I have to get an AV person.
And also, when you left Ivy to go to Virginia, with your children in tow, and slaves and your belongings, you left without Mr. Marks. He stayed behind to do
Well, as I said, Mr. Marks was determined that we should move. This is the time that we moved from Virginia to Georgia when I was first married to Mr. Marks. We did pull all of our assets together, and the overseer was drunk, naturally. Mr. Marks decided he had met up with some friends that he wanted to visit with for a while. He said he'd catch up with me in a couple of hours. So I rode the saddle horse that was tied to the back of one of the wagons, went to the meeting place where we were supposed to be back together, and Mr. Marks showed up 3 days later. The purpose of a woman is to serve. That is what I do.
Thank you.
Sometime after Meriwether's death, I think I understand, a person who I think was a good friend of Meriwether, by the name of Alexander Wilson, came through and made sure that the grave had a fence put up around it and so on. I believe that Meriwether met Alexander Wilson in Philadelphia and become friends with him at that point. Did Meriwether ever write to you about that possible friendship between Alexander Wilson and Meriwether?
I do not recall Meriwether mentioning him by name. He met so many people as they were getting ready to go on their journey, and I do not recall that name specifically. I do not even know about his visit to Brutus State. But then, don't know a lot of things.
Question?
What do you know about your son's drinking, especially after he came back from the expedition?
Well, what do I know about my son's drinking? Well, I can't think of a planter or gentleman in the South that doesn't drink. There are those, and I know the stories that go, there are those who say that he drank to excess. If I had only been able to talk to him in those last years of his life, I might have understood more about what you refer to. All I know is what I found out after the fact. He was an enthusiastic drinker, so the time was upon him. I always think sometimes in the journals, when he wrote that they had run out of whiskey, I felt exceedingly pleased and hoped that maybe that could continue, but it did not. Honestly, I think maybe I will take my time with you all, and thank you so much, but I don't want you to go anywhere. Sit right there. Thank you so much.
All right, we're not done yet. We're doing a little conversion here. Our speaker is Mary Jane Bradbury. You probably read that in the program. A storyteller and historic interpreter who's traveled the Rocky Mountains over the last 30 years, bringing history to life to audiences of all ages. She's a member of Humanities Montana, Colorado Humanities Speakers Bureau, and an artist in residence for the C.M. Russell Museum and the Montana Historical Society. She holds a master's in speech communications from Regis University. Before moving to Montana in 2014, she was an historic enactor for the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. She lives in Helena, Montana. I've got a little side story. When she moved here in 2014, she immediately started doing first-person reenactments. And I had the privilege to see her in one of her first Montana performances as Nancy Russell, Charlie Russell's wife. Since then, I've seen her do Jeanette Rankin and other women, famous Montana women. And here's the neat part. When we first started organizing this thing 4 years ago, we had that little COVID thing in between. So we had some time to prepare. But the first person on our list was this lady right here. And she's, I called her up, or maybe I emailed her, and I said, Mary Jane, could you help us out with this annual meeting that's coming up? And she said, Bruce, I can't do Sacagawea. So with that said, and with her vivid imagination and creativity, she came up with this, especially for you in this audience. You just saw the premiere of Lucy Moore. So I'll step aside if you want to ask Mary Jane Bradbury now what you'd like to know about her personally. It's open forum.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, indeed. This was, wow, preaching to the choir. I did this for the Montana Historical Society as kind of a workshop. for one of their speaker series in March, just to see how it would go over. And this is a story that happens before women began to embrace the reform movement. You can see, you must be obedient and agreeable to your husband. Women, especially in the South, had a lot of responsibility, but no authority. And so Lucy was right on the cusp of the movements that would begin to change things for women. She died in 1837. The year later, Angelina Grimke spoke at an abolitionist conference in Philadelphia. First time a woman spoke in public against slavery. So there's a lot of things to unpack in this story. There's a number of things about women in the South that I would like to touch on. And it's as Lucy's story. This isn't about, I kept thinking, well, what should I say about Meriwether? No, everybody else is talking about Meriwether and Clark. Why don't I talk about her? And the life of a plantation mistress. This was an area of women's history I knew nothing about. And those women were quite remarkable. So I'd like to go into a little bit of that, some specifics about Lucy herself, but are there any questions before I go down that road about this story in the way?
Did you get to go to Locust Hill?
Oh, I haven't yet, but I've been meeting people in the last couple of days who happen to know people who know people. I want to go east. I don't know anything about the southeast, so I wanted to go to Monticello and Williamsburg and just kind of immerse myself in an era of history that I'm not used to. You put me in 1850 forward, Civil War and all the reform in the turn of the 20th century, and I'm pretty good, but this was new to me, so it was quite an adventure to learn all of these things. Yes?
So did she sell the Marks place when she moved back to Locust Hill?
Okay, so did she sell the Marks place in Georgia when she moved back to, so as a woman whose husband died in those, the firstborn boy was the inheritor, but if he was underage, the woman, the mother, had what I understand are dower rights, and that was a certain percentage of the property, and also keeping track of it. Now, Lucy had a huge family. She was one of 11 brothers and sisters. The Marks family was big, so there were plenty of uncles, plenty of the men who could take care of things. When they left Locust Hill to go to Georgia, they left it with uncles and the overseer there. They're over here in Georgia. Mr. Marks dies. Now, her children there were John Marks and Mary. So that little boy, John, was the inheritor, with her having the dower rights. But there's not a lot written about the legal part of this. So I imagine she left it in the hands of the family that was there. There are letters later from Meriwether to various parties sorting out John's inheritance there. So I believe it did stay in holding for when John, her second son, would grow up and inherit it.
Thank you.
Have you read the journal yourself?
Have I what?
Have you read the journal yourself?
Have I read the journals?
It's a long, it's a good one.
I have read about every book about the journal. Okay, all right, here you all are. You're all so amazing. I ask a question and I get all this wonderful information from whatever topic. Mr. Pat from Texas and the journals. I said, what are the journals? What were those journals like? What would they have looked like when she held that journal in her hand and her son lived again? What, am I wrong? Am I right? Should he do? And I got this wonderful tutorial on the journals and the history of them. So the answer to the question is I have not read the journals, but I've read everybody around them. Looking, as you might imagine, for Lucy. Everybody mentions her. The main place where I got sort of the timeline for this narrative came from an exhibit that was done at Monticello in the early 2000s. And they had references to her. The really sad thing about her, The year after she died, Locust Hill burned. Now, can you imagine in her herb shed, her books, her notes? She had a library that in today's dollars would be several $100s. She was a learned woman. I know she made notes. And so let me give you some of the descriptions, contemporary descriptions of her. There's one existing image of her. It's a painting, and it's I hope it was painted the day before she died, because it's pretty awful. She's very old in it and doesn't look terribly. What the descriptions are? The descriptions are fine features, fragile figure, masterful eye. Her activity went beyond her sex. That, coupled with known for her intellectual interests, is where I kind of landed with, is she going to talk about the Stamp Act? Is she going to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion? And, well, yeah, because she was the owner of this huge plantation. Her economic survival, her livelihood depended on it. And like her mother before her, she neglected to say, she learned to be firm with her servants. Those unfamiliar with the way of life in the South found the system of enslaved labor to be disagreeable. And I understand, I do. But we are Virginians, and our loyalty to our country and to our family is important. There's no discounting the facts of this system, but it is legal and it is common sense. Now, she was a Virginia lady of patrician breed, a benevolent family autocrat, a character sharp and definite. For generations, her descendants referred to her as Grandma Marge. She was sincere, truthful, industrious, and kind without limit. And when she died, she owned 47 slaves. Provided for all of them in her will. This by no means makes slavery by any stretch of the imagination acceptable. It wasn't, there's just no way to defend it. Were there nice slave owners and horrible slave owners? Yeah, there definitely were. But that doesn't excuse any of it. And so when we talk a little bit more about her religion, we'll talk about what I think she had a great internal struggle with. And that is, well, we'll go there now. Any other questions before I run down this path? Yeah.
From your talk, it sounds like for most plantation women, that marriage was of convenience. Is that the kind of the pattern of that time frame of plantations?
Oh, yes. Was marriage convenient? A daughter in a family of a wealthy planter in Virginia seems to be the poster child for all in the Southern. What was her economic worth? Could she keep herself attractive enough to get a good husband? And then it didn't matter. This whole idea that women were the commodity and children, both women and men, boys and girls, were seen as economic assets to the planter, and what order you were born in, what interests you had. If you're firstborn, you get the property if the father dies. But if you have about 10 other brothers, then they have to all make their way. And so in the case of Lucy, she was 17 when she married Robert Lewis. So here's an interesting thing. So she was born to Thomas, I think her mother's name was
Lucy.
Lucy.
Or her mother was
Mary. Okay. When Thomas Meriwether died, Lucy married Robert Lewis.
Lucy married William Lewis.
Lucy Meriwether's mother married William. I did it in alphabetical order so I remember. She married a man named Mr. Lewis. He had a bunch of pretty much grown sons, and one of them became Lucy's husband. So it's sort of her stepbrother became her husband. Genealogy in the South is a real interesting mixture. So that's why her name is Lucy, Meriwether, her maiden name, Lewis, her first husband, and Mark's her second husband.
Was in again.
Yes?
What would happen to the girls that were born in a family that had a lot of boys if they didn't marry? Were they spinsters, and who would have taken care of them?
What would happen to the girls in the family if they didn't marry? Up until well into the 19th century, a woman without an ability to become married and have a man to take care of her didn't have a lot to turn to. Spinster, that's where it comes from. You put the unmarried girls down in the loom house and let them spin all day. And that's where it comes from. And so you have to make use of everybody on the plantation. Let me kind of make some connections here for you about the life of a Southern plantation mistress. Now this was to be her job, I mean, the minute she was born. In terms of education, her stepfather, I think, was uncommon. It wasn't considered necessary to educate a woman with any sort of academic learning. After the Revolution, there were schools in the North that started. Of course, after the Revolution, you get a bigger divide between North and South, and education and non-education, or not seeing the necessity for education. But her stepfather was, I think, maybe ahead of his time or just being practical, so that his daughters would have some knowledge, so that she could go into this world. But it wasn't considered after the Revolution, when women went north to go to school because prosperous planters could send them up there, and it was kind of becoming acceptable. But one father wrote that he thought it was foolish for Southern girls to be exposed to that kind of thinking, as it would do nothing to help them in their role on the plantation, and that imbibing in manners and habits not perfectly congenial to the people in the South, where they were destined to live, would expose them to intellectual freedom that they would not be able to use. And one woman wrote to her brother, I think this is just heartbreaking. She said, "It's best that I yielded to Papa. I wonder when my best will cease to be painful, and when I shall begin to enjoy life instead of enduring it." So you can see where the field was being plowed for the women's reform movement. But in the South, plantation mistresses were an essential part of the slave system. They did everything. And so managing a household, training, maintaining, reprimanding staff, the plantation mistress and the overseer, she could override his punishments, but she also had to maintain control. The orderly conduct of all was her job. But so just as an example, these plantations, especially the large ones, were like mini industrial complexes, if you will, with the woman in charge of food, clothing, physical and spiritual care for her white family and her husband's slaves. So here are some of the, one woman, when girls grew up and they had that little gap between when they came of age and came out, they were in society and then got married. There was a gap of freedom, but they all wrote about it. They could go to parties and they could have, life be just fun. But then one woman wrote, "Now that I have turned housekeeper, I know there is no romance in going from the smokehouse to the storeroom to the cellar half a dozen times a day." The plantation mistress had to see to the livestock with the exception of the master's riding and carriage horses, harvesting of the kitchen garden, dairy production. We didn't have an ice house. Dairy production was every single day, milking and making butter. And if you had a large plantation with 50 or more slaves, you had a lot of people to provide food for. The putting up of pork, I let Lucy mention it. It's butchering season, and that's when she heard about Meriwether's return. I don't know, nobody knows. I asked every scholar I could find, every author, how did she find out? Did somebody write her a letter? Was it in a newspaper in Charlottesville and somebody raced out the road and told her? That's how I let her find out. That's people speculated. And I just put it all in a pot and said, well, I think this is what probably happened. But in those days, you know, the time lag from when something happened to when you would get news for it. But she was in the midst of putting up the pork, and hog butchering was a huge, huge part of plantation life and a lot of work. And actually, Thomas Jefferson preferred the hams that came from Locust Hill to his own. Candle making, soap making, and in a day's work, she mentioned that she thought that he used a month's worth of candles for one night celebration at Monticello. So 30 dozen candles was a month's worth of candles. You had to make them. Collecting feathers, now think about this. Pillows and comforters and mattresses, quills, nothing got away from the plantation mistress's purview for collecting. And the biggest, really biggest one was clothing production. So a loom house, you spun your, when trade resumed with England, you could get fabric. But if you had 50 slaves to clothe, so we'll do some math, 2 to 3 shirts a year, a pair of trousers every year, socks, it takes a week to knit a pair of socks, 2 pairs of socks per person for the year. You could give wool, maybe the yarn, to the slaves and have them knit their own socks if they could, but you know, there was a tremendous amount. Blankets, once the war came, you know, they had to weave yard upon yard upon yard of fabric to keep this in operation. So you can see why, if the British come over the hill and burn the house down and leave all those people standing out in the road, which they did, it was a tremendous amount of pressure and anxiety on people during the Revolution. And in the midst of all that work, childbearing. That was pretty much your main goal. After you were doing all this other, you were bearing children, going through 9 months of pregnancy, and then it wasn't a given that everyone would survive a birth. A lot of infant mortality and maternal mortality. So it was just quite a way to live. But when it's your destiny and it's your duty, a wonderful book, Plantation Mistresses, by a scholar named Catherine Clinton. And I spoke to her, I reached out to her. And it's an interesting thing how history changes. Of course, history doesn't change, but how we look at it does. She wrote that book with all of this context about the daily life of the women. And she wrote it in the 1980s, and that was when a lot of women's scholarship, good scholarship, with qualified, not just storytelling, myth-making people were doing the research. And she said, that book, I read it, and I thought, oh, because this book talks about the compassionate plantation mistress, the slave of the slave. They were just a step above the enslaved people on their property because they had so much restriction, but they also recognized how awful slavery was. And I thought, oh, well then I'll just give Lucy that, because certainly from the other description, she was compassionate and caring. And when I spoke to this author, Dr. Clinton, she said, well, you know, I wrote that book 40 years ago. And things have changed. She said it's no longer thought in scholarly circles that the plantation mistresses were necessarily of a mind to be compassionate. They were capitalists, they were in a system of exploiting other people for their legacy and for their family, and if that is your main goal, then you don't have necessarily a real, let's free everybody, see how it goes. Dolly Madison was a Quaker, and when the Declaration of Independence was signed, her father freed all his slaves, said, we're going to do this ourselves. And within a few years, they were destitute. So they had to move to town. They didn't have anybody to work the land. They kind of went into just a very modest lifestyle. They were Quakers, and it was more important to him to follow with his beliefs. She eventually married Madison, James Madison, who had a big plantation. So where was the line between women and what their duty was and what they were there to protect for their families and their internal compass? And so in terms of Lucy, one of the things that's very interesting about Lucy is that she became a Methodist. The Anglican Church was the main church in the colonies, and when the war was over, that stopped being the case. In Jefferson, even in Virginia, passed a law separating church and state. And the Anglican Church evolved into what is the Episcopal Church now. It remained the main religion for the planter class, the men. But the Protestant religions and their revivals, and they really had a fertile ground to come in because the plantation mistresses were in charge of the spiritual life of their domain. And it offered them an opportunity to at least feel feel a way of charity, for example, maybe being able to take care of other people. And the Methodists were huge in Georgia. So probably when she moved to Georgia, she joined the church. It was John Wesley and his brother Charles came to Georgia, and that's where they set up. So there was a big religion in Georgia. When she went back to Locust Hill, the Methodist church was 7 or 8 miles away, so she donated land on her property to build a church right there. She was very committed to her Methodism, and Methodists were abolitionists. And they evangelized a lot of the slaves in those days. So Dr. Clinton said, well, Virginians always had this internal battle between morality and economy. We just couldn't get away from it. But I wonder in her life and mind, as she had her strong beliefs, how she was able to reconcile. Again, make her a nice person, but she still owned those slaves. When Meriwether died, Meriwether was a Mason. And the Masonic, as I understand it, Masonic beliefs aren't a religion per se, but they do have a higher power that is referred to and respected, and that is what they believe. There is a higher power, but it isn't affiliated with a religion. There were a lot of early Masons in the colonies that were Christians, but it wasn't a black and white situation. But he was with Jefferson, the deist, the Enlightenment person, as his father figure, telling him all these things about science. And so there isn't, again, I just had Lucy's journal where she wrote all those conversations with Meriwether, but what did she think her son thought? I don't know. To take your life was not a good thing in any religion. It brought very old traditions and things brought shame on the family. It reflected badly that you were unstable. In some of the stricter times, it could mean that your whole estate, your whole family's estate was taken away, and you were hung in the public square upside down without any clothes on, and made a big spectacle. It was a terrible thing to do. I know that in this culture, all of you, there's a lot of debate about, and probably leaning more to one side than the other, about how Meriwether died. I tried to be vague enough in interpreting her. She thought they were all too quick to accept the verdict of death by his own hand, and they did go down. Nobody was sent down there to look into this. It was local authorities. Well, what were the local authorities in Grinderstan? So she was left to know that her son was buried somewhere out in the woods, and who was there? I mean, it was probably just so devastating for her. But she carried on. So, any other questions? Now that I've kind of run down some of the areas of Lucy versus the times in which she lived. Yes?
Do you think that she ever talked to Clark afterwards? How did you know that she refused?
So, how do I know that she refused to see Clark? Clark stopped at he put it in his journal.
Okay.
In early December. And it's only 3 sentences. Okay, so here's the interpreter now.
Okay.
The storyteller put 3 sentences in his journal. He said, I stopped at Locust Hill. Mrs. Marks was not there. Family sorely distressed, whatever.
Okay, thank you.
So now here's where history kind of becomes the enemy of storytelling, because history wants facts and fiction. What fact and what isn't? Storytellers are looking for what's factual and what is inspired, what is human, what could happen. So honestly, what if she was there? Clark going to put in his journal, stopped at Locust Hill. Mrs. Marks was there. She was really upset, and she yelled at me so hard that I can't even begin to tell you what she said. Okay, no, he's going to put Mrs. Marks not there. So
Time for-
there.
Excuse me, one more question, we're running short on.
Can you tell us about the end of your life, the final days of your life?
Can I tell the final thing of my life? Wow, I hope. Mary Jane Bradbury's life?
We're back in 2023.
So Lucy lived, she was riding her horse across the hills for, until the year before she died, treating people. She was a very strong, healthy woman. There's no description of what it was like when she died. And she's buried there at Locust Hill Cemetery. Her family was with her. As I said, her home burned the following year, so everything that might have pointed to more of the story is lost. The thing I'll leave you with Meriwether, and I just sort of came to understanding this, Meriwether was an uncommon child. He was curious. He wouldn't sit still to have classes. He wanted to be always learning. He was the perfect person for the role that he played in history. Lucy was an uncommon woman. She was known to be intellectually interested. She had a big library. She was active beyond her sex. So she had this little child who she could really connect with, because he had a mother who he could understand, would listen to him and not just pass him off what he said. They had each other in one of those cosmic moments where 2 souls need to be on a journey together. And I think that's what makes every person who tells his story talks about her, because that was as much a part of his relationship with the world as it was.
How old was she when she died?
85.
Well, first of all, thank you. It was a wonderful job. Now, with all these people that you have done before in your other jobs, your other persons, how did you just, you seem to really just embrace this one. I mean, I mean, you felt like that all of them, but thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Well, it's my role, it's my service.
You did a great job.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again.